Putin is afraid, not of a battlefield reversal he can spin, not of a diplomatic failure he can deny. He is afraid of something far more specific, far more visible, and far more humiliating. And it is happening right now in real time as Russia prepares for its single most politically sacred day of the year, May 9th, Victory Day, the parade of legacy armor and inherited glory down Red Square. The moment the Kremlin packages its entire narrative of strength, historical legitimacy, and military invincibility into 90 minutes of choreographed theater for the Russian people and the watching world. For Vladimir Putin, this date is not a celebration. It is a load-bearing pillar of his political identity, and Ukraine has decided to put a drone directly through it. Let me be precise about what I mean. In the days leading into this year's May 9th, Ukrainian long-range drone strikes have been threading deeper into Russian territory with a frequency, geographic reach, and targeting logic that is not random. It is deliberate, it is calibrated, and it is aimed at something far more fragile than a fuel depot or a radar array. It is aimed at the myth that Russia is untouchable inside its own borders, the myth that the Kremlin controls the narrative of this war, the myth that Victory Day can still be presented as proof of Russian strength when Ukrainian drones are visible in the skies above Russian cities the night before the parade begins. This is not a story about drones. This is a story about what happens when a military built on information control, territorial sanctity, and symbolic dominance loses all three simultaneously and cannot recover the initiative because the doctrinal assumptions that once protected those advantages are already broken beyond repair. What happens next changes everything. And I am going to walk you through exactly why. Pull the lens back to where this assumption failure actually began, because the mainstream framing of this moment gets it almost entirely wrong. Most analysis focuses on the tactical question: can Ukraine hit Moscow? Can Russian air defenses intercept the strikes? Will the parade be canceled? Those are the wrong questions. They are the questions of people reading the surface of the war rather than its structure. The correct question is this: what did Russia believe about its own territorial immunity, and when did that belief calcify into a doctrinal assumption so rigid that the entire Kremlin security architecture was built on top of it? The answer goes back to a foundational Russian military and political premise that predates this war by decades. Russia assumed that the depth of its territory was itself a form of defense, that the sheer geographic mass of the Russian state, 11 time zones, thousands of kilometers of rear area, the historical memory of armies that tried to penetrate that depth and were consumed by it, constituted an invisible shield. This was not merely a strategic calculation, it was an identity claim. Russia is big, Russia is deep. Russia cannot be touched inside Russia. That belief shaped everything from air defense deployment priorities to the political theater of Moscow parades, to the Kremlin's willingness to keep critical military infrastructure well inside what it assumed were safe boundaries. Ukraine did not accept that premise, and that refusal to accept a Russian-defined reality is the single most consequential doctrinal decision of this entire war. Beginning in 2023, Ukrainian long-range strike capacity began methodically dismantling the geographic immunity assumption. Oil refineries in Saratov, airfields in Engels, ammunition depots in Belgorod, in Bryansk, in Voronezh. Each strike was covered in Western media as a tactical event. Ukraine hit X, Russia denied or minimized, life went on. That framing missed the point entirely. The point was not the damage per strike. The point was the proof of concept being delivered over and over in escalating depth and frequency. Russian territory is not a sanctuary. Russian airspace is not controlled. The boundary that Russia drew around its own immunity does not exist. And it gets even more serious from here. By late 2023, the frequency of deep penetration drone strikes had crossed a threshold that matters enormously from a doctrinal standpoint. When individual strikes happen sporadically, a military and political system can absorb them as anomalies, exceptions that prove the rule of safety. When they happen with regularity, with increasing geographic range, and with demonstrable targeting sophistication, they stop being anomalies. They become the new baseline. They become the environment. And that shift from anomaly to environment is not a tactical development. It is a strategic one. It means the assumption of sanctuary is gone, and no amount of air defense investment can fully restore it because the cost exchange now permanently favors the attacker. Let me walk you through what this actually means at the strategic level, because this is where the doctrine lesson becomes irreversible. Russia's air defense architecture was built for a specific threat model: high altitude, high speed aircraft and ballistic missiles with detectable launch signatures and predictable flight paths. The S-400, the S-300, the Pantsir, these are sophisticated systems optimized for that threat model. What they were not optimized for, because Russian military planners did not seriously plan for it, was a mass of small, low-altitude, commercially derived, autonomy-assisted drones flying terrain-following profiles at speeds too slow to reliably trigger radar thresholds and too numerous to engage cost-effectively even when detected. This is the hidden military variable that the mainstream coverage consistently underweights. The problem is not that Russian air defenses are bad. The problem is that they are solving the wrong problem. A system designed to intercept a $10 million missile with a $3 million interceptor is already in an unfavorable exchange ratio. A system trying to intercept a $50,000 drone with a $1 million Pantsir missile round is in a catastrophic one. And when Ukraine launches these strikes in waves, 50, 80, 120 drones simultaneously, the math does not just become unfavorable, it becomes structurally insoluble. You cannot intercept or buy your way out of a mass drone saturation campaign when the adversary's production cost is a fraction of your interception cost. Russia understood this problem intellectually. What it failed to do was solve it operationally before the window closed, and the window is now closed. Pull the lens back further, because the targeting logic of the May 9th period strikes is not random. It is deliberately chosen to maximize the political and psychological damage to the one asset Putin cannot afford to lose: the credibility of the Victory Day narrative. Consider what Victory Day actually requires to function as political theater. It requires visible military assets, tanks, missiles, aircraft, performing in Moscow without disruption. It requires the Russian population to see their military as dominant and their capital as invulnerable. It requires the international audience to receive images of Russian power, not images of Russian air defense systems desperately trying to engage drones over Russian cities. And it requires the Kremlin to control the information environment around the event, to project strength rather than reaction. Ukraine's drone campaign in the days before and around May 9th directly attacks each of those requirements simultaneously, not with a single decisive blow, but with the accumulated weight of persistent pressure across multiple dimensions at once. That is the doctrine lesson here. This is not Ukraine trying to destroy a parade. Ukraine does not need to destroy the parade. All Ukraine needs to do is make the parade visually and psychologically ambiguous, to ensure that the images coming out of May 9th are competing with images of smoke trails over Russian cities, of air defense activations in the Moscow region, of flight restrictions over the capital's airspace. Because the moment those images exist simultaneously, the Kremlin's ability to use May 9th as proof of strength collapses. The narrative war is lost, even if the parade happens. And here's the larger pattern this confirms. What we are watching is Ukraine systematically applying doctrinal pressure to the specific points where Russian power is most dependent on perception rather than reality. Russia's military strength is in significant part of performance, not entirely, but enough. The performance of strength is load-bearing for domestic political stability. It is load-bearing for elite cohesion inside the Kremlin. It is load-bearing for Russia's relationships with states that calculate their alignment based on who appears to be winning. Ukraine has identified this structural dependency and is now treating it as a target set. Let me walk you through the escalation timeline, because the numbers here tell a story that the headline coverage consistently buries. In the first year of this war, Ukrainian drone strikes into Russian territory, numbered in the dozens, significant as proof of concept, limited in aggregate effect. By the second year, that number had crossed into the hundreds. By the third year, individual strike packages were reaching 100 or more drones in a single night. The Engels Air Base, home to Russian strategic bombers capable of launching cruise missiles at Ukrainian cities, was struck multiple times. The Kremlin's own air defense umbrella around Moscow was activated on numerous occasions. Russian airlines began rerouting flights. Construction of drone barriers and anti-drone infrastructure became visible across multiple Russian oblasts. Each of these is a data point, but the pattern they form is not tactical. It is a portrait of a military that built its strategic architecture on an assumption of rear area safety and is now discovering too late that the assumption was always the vulnerability. What happens next changes everything in ways that compound beyond the battlefield. Consider the industrial dimension, because this is where the consequence logic escalates from operational to existential in strategic terms. Russia's defense industrial base, the factories, the storage facilities, the logistics nodes that feed the front line, is heavily concentrated in geographic clusters that made sense under the assumption of rear area safety. Ural industrial centers, Tatarstan aviation facilities, Bryansk and Tula ammunition and armor production. These were built where they were built precisely because they were presumed safe from air attack. They were designed for throughput, not for hardening against a persistent drone threat. Ukraine has been systematically demonstrating that these industrial nodes are reachable. Not all of them have been struck with decisive effect. But demonstrating reachability is itself a military achievement of enormous value. Because once you demonstrate that a target is reachable, the adversary must divert resources to defend it, resources that are not then available for the front. Every Pantsir battery deployed to protect an oil refinery in Tatarstan is a Pantsir battery not protecting a frontline position in Zaporizhzhia. Every early warning radar asset oriented inward to protect Moscow airspace is an asset not oriented toward incoming Ukrainian strikes from the west. The drone campaign creates a resource allocation crisis inside Russian air defense that is geometric rather than linear. Each new threat vector requires a defensive response that degrades the coverage of existing sectors. That is a force multiplication effect that no amount of media coverage has adequately quantified. And it is getting more serious as Ukraine's strike range and volume both continue to increase. Now, let me bring this to the May 9th dimension specifically, because what is happening around this year's Victory Day is not just operationally significant. It is historically significant in ways that will take years to fully recognize. Victory Day 2024 saw Putin surrounded by a thinning cohort of international attendees. Victory Day this year is occurring under conditions where Russian air defense has already been activated multiple times in the Moscow region in preceding weeks, a fact that cannot be hidden from the Russian population, regardless of what state media reports, because ordinary Russian citizens can hear the activations, see the contrails, and access enough non-state information to understand what they are witnessing. The Kremlin's information architecture assumed that the Russian population's information environment could be controlled. That assumption is also breaking down. And it is breaking down for exactly the same structural reason as the air defense assumption. The system was designed for a threat model that no longer matches the environment it is operating in. Here is what I want you to understand about the political weight of this moment, because this is where the strategic and the historical converge. Putin's political compact with the Russian population is not based on democratic legitimacy. It is based on the twin pillars of economic stability and national security, and specifically on the claim that he, Putin, has restored Russian greatness and made Russians safe from the humiliations of the 1990s. May 9th is the single most important ritual enactment of that second pillar. It is the day when the inheritance of Soviet military sacrifice is claimed as validation of current power. When drones are visible over Russian cities in the days surrounding that ritual, when the Russian population must confront the reality that their capital's airspace is contested, that Ukrainian strikes are penetrating deeper than they were told was possible, the compact is damaged in ways that cannot be repaired by doubling the parade's tank count. Pull the lens back one final time and let me tell you what the larger pattern confirms. Every assumption Russia built its military and political architecture on is being tested simultaneously. The assumption of geographic depth, the assumption of air defense dominance over its own territory, the assumption of information control over its own population, the assumption that May 9th can still serve its function as a proof of strength. Each of these assumptions is failing, not because of a single dramatic breakthrough, but because of the accumulated pressure of a Ukrainian military that has learned faster, adapted faster, and identified the structural load-bearing points of Russian power more accurately than any Western analysis predicted it would. This is the doctrinal lesson that history will record about this phase of the war. The side that won the adaptation race did not win it with superior resources. It won it by targeting the assumptions of the adversary rather than simply trying to outfight them on their own terms. Ukraine decided early that it could not defeat Russia in a straight attrition contest, so it chose a different contest, one fought against the architecture of Russian assumptions, and it is winning that contest methodically, one shattered premise at a time. The May 9th drone campaign is not Ukraine trying to cancel a parade. It is Ukraine delivering a message that cannot be intercepted, translated, or denied. Your sanctuary is gone, your narrative is contested, and your most sacred day of military theater is happening under drone alert. That message will be received by the Russian population, by the Russian elite, by the states watching from the outside and calculating which side of this war to align with, and by Putin himself, who understands better than anyone that once a population begins to see the theater for what it is, no amount of additional performance restores the suspension of disbelief. What comes next will tell us a great deal about how close that threshold actually is. Because if Russia cannot defend its capital's airspace on May 9th, if the images that compete with the parade are images of interception attempts and flight diversions, then a structural question will be asked inside Russia that has not been seriously asked before. Not yet answered, but asked. And that question, once it enters the room, does not leave quietly. Stay with us, because the answer to that question will not arrive in a single headline. It will arrive in the accumulated weight of events across the weeks that follow, and I will be here to walk you through exactly what they mean at the level that matters.